Hi, I've been invited to give two talks, one on the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem in '48, and the other on the creation of the Jewish Sephardi community refugee problem during the 1950s and 60s. So I'll begin with the first lecture. I'll talk for perhaps something like 30 minutes, 35 minutes, and then we'll leave the floor open for questions. Afterwards, we'll have a break, and then I'll give the second talk. So the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem in 1948. Well, to begin with, it's very, very important, the refugee problem. And the importance in history is often judged, or mostly judged, by longevity. That is, the problem has remained and persisted with us, and in fact grown numerically, and perhaps even in importance in Israeli-Arab relations, steadily since 1948. One can say that the 1948 had two major consequences. One was the creation of the State of Israel, in some ways a consequence of the war, of the results of the war, and the other was the creation of the refugee problem, which, as I said, is still high on the agenda, perhaps the most prominent problem on the agenda between Israel and the Palestinians, and unfortunately probably the most important obstacle to peacemaking between Israel and the Palestinians, perhaps between Israel and the Arab world. There's a controversy about the numbers. Israel maintained at the end of the '48 war that 520,000 Arabs had been displaced from their homes as a result of the war. The Arabs usually spoke immediately after '48 about 1 million refugees. And probably the number is somewhere in the middle, something like 700,000. This was what was found by two different UN committees which looked into the subject in '49-50. Today, somewhere between 4.5 and 5.5 million people are registered on the United Nations rolls as Palestinian refugees, those being those who still remain or are alive from the '48 refugees, and their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. All are designated refugees. There is a problem with the definition refugees, both in relation to the original ones from '48, those 700,000, and of course in relation to their descendants. The problem with the original so-called refugees is that a refugee is normally defined, you'll find that in the Oxford Dictionary, for example, in English, as somebody displaced from their country as a result of war, persecution, and what have you. And most of the refugees, so-called refugees from '48, most of the 700,000, perhaps 500,000 of them, were displaced from one part of Palestine to another, not out of Palestine. So they were actually not refugees by normal definitions. 1/3 who were displaced out of the country to Syria, Lebanon, Transjordan were or can be properly designated refugees. 500,000 were displaced from one area of Palestine to another, from Jaffa to the Gaza Strip, from Haifa to the West Bank, and so on. But the West Bank and Gaza, of course, are part of Palestine, historic Palestine, mandatory Palestine. So there's a problem with the definition, but the world has accepted since '48 that all those displaced from their homes, wherever they were displaced to, are refugees, and also accepts that their descendants, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, are also refugees, and we'll stick to this definition in this talk. Just to give you one or two facts about the dispersal, something like 350,000 of the 700,000 ended up in the West Bank. In the Gaza Strip, something like 200,000 ended up. In East Jordan, or Transjordan, across the river, another 100,000, and 90,000 in Lebanon and 60,000 in Syria. Those numbers, as I said, have grown more or less fivefold, sixfold, sevenfold since then. So Lebanon, for example, now has 400,000 people who are designated Palestinian refugees. There are two traditional explanations of why 700,000 people were displaced in 1948 from their homes. Arabs, some 70,000 Jews, incidentally, were displaced from their homes in Palestine during the war as well. Many of them returned to their homes if they remained within the state of Israel. Some didn't. People from the Etzion bloc and so on were displaced from their homes and eventually settled somewhere else in Israel, in the areas of Palestine which became Israel. But there was also a small internal Jewish refugee problem created by the 48 war. It's worth knowing. The traditional explanations of why 700,000 were displaced are two. The Arab explanation, which is very simple, is that the Zionist movement came to Palestine with the intention of taking over the land and displacing its inhabitants, expelling its native inhabitants, the Palestinian Arabs, or what became known as the Palestinian Arabs. This was part of Zionist ideology, and it was systematically implemented according to the Arab description, the traditional Arab description, systematically implemented during the 1948 war. And this is the traditional Arab narrative. It dominates all Arab discourse, Palestinian discourse, on the subject of the refugees. A predetermined, systematic expulsion by the Jews. The Jewish explanation, the traditional Zionist explanation of what happened in 48, which began to be related already during the course of the 48 war, was that the Arabs, those displaced from their homes, left their homes at the behest of their leaders, on orders from their leaders, on the advice of their leaders. That they weren't expelled by the Jews, but that their leaders told them to leave the country for various reasons, one of which was to clear the battlefield of Arab bystanders, so that when the Arab armies invaded, they wouldn't also necessarily injure the Arabs or kill the Arabs who lived in Palestine. They would move out, armies would come in, clear battlefields, beat the Jews, and then the Palestinian Arabs would return. That's the Zionist explanation, one of the explanations. The other explanation is, according to the Zionist narrative, traditional Zionist narrative, was that the Arab leaders told the Arabs to leave in order to blacken the Jews' image, because then they could say that Jews expelled them. And that would, of course, justify the Arab invasion, which occurred in May. So there are two reasons why, in the Zionist narrative, the Arabs advised or told the Palestinian Arabs to leave their homes. I'll deal with both. The truth of what happened, as it emerges from the documentation opened in Israel, in the Western countries, especially England. The truth of what happened lies somewhere between the two explanations, and also contains elements of both narratives, the Zionist narrative and the traditional Arab narrative. But the truth, on large, lies somewhere in the middle. Before I approach what happened in 48, one must take account of a number of preconditions which made possible or necessitated the creation of the refugee problem. Without mentioning these preconditions, without taking them into account, one can't really understand why it happened, why 700,000 of Palestine's 1.3 million Arabs were displaced. And these preconditions are as follows. One was that some of the Zionist leaders, especially important leaders like Ben-Gurion and Weizmann, during the 1930s and early 1940s, took into account or considered the possibility of solving the so-called Arab problem, as it was seen from the Zionist side, by transfer of some or all of the Arabs out of Palestine, or out of the area in Palestine which would become the Jewish state. This occurred, this adoption or partial adoption by some of the Zionist leaders of transfer thinking occurred against the background, or a dual background, of Arab attacks on Jews and expulsionist ideology on the part of the Arabs vis-à-vis the Jews of Palestine.